Greetings and welcome to another video. This afternoon I finished reading another Star Trek novel, and it's one that I've had a few years now. This copy of this book I purchased from a car boot sale in Wellington a few years ago. I don't know why it took me so long to actually get round to reading this book, but in the end I did, and I enjoyed reading this book from cover to cover. So yeah, the book in question is Star Trek: The Last Years by J.M. Dillard. So yeah, it's about Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, and Dr. McCoy. And to be honest, I quite enjoy the front cover of this book. The three men lined up there, and the Enterprise itself in orbit of Earth. So yeah, and back cover, just a variation of what you've seen on the front. It's a good book, very good book. I'm just going to read to you what it says right here, and this is the synopsis of the book, a brief overview of the story within these pages. So yeah, The Last Years. What exactly happened to the crew of the USS Enterprise after the end of their 5-year mission? How did that mission end? What did they do before they were reunited for the Star Trek films? Even casual Star Trek fans finds him or herself asking these questions from time to time. Here, at last, is the book that provides answers to those questions. A book as anticipated in its own way as Spock's World was, and one that promises to equal its New York Times bestseller success. The Last Years tells the story of Captain Kirk's final hours in command of the USS Enterprise, and how he, Mr. Spock, and Dr. McCoy struggle to establish new lives apart from each other and the starship. We see the newly promoted Admiral Kirk in charge of a specially created Starfleet division as he attempts to defuse a critical hostage situation. Mr. Spock, who in the midst of a teaching assignment on Vulcan, finds the one thing he least expected. And Dr. McCoy, whose unerring instinct for trouble lands him smack in the middle of an incident that could trigger an interstellar bloodbath. In the Last Years, J.M. Dillard, author of the Star Trek V: The Final Frontier novelization, has written her best book to date and has bridged a gap in Star Trek history in a manner sure to excite and delight Star Trek fans everywhere. And there's a bit more on the back here. J.M. Dillard is the author of 3 previous Star Trek novels, Mind Shadow, Demons, and Bloodthirst, as well as the best-selling novelization for Star Trek V: The Final Frontier. She is currently hand at work on a horror suspense novel. The Star Trek novels, an opening series of original paperbacks, have provided pleasure to millions of readers around the world for more than 2 decades, building a loyalty and popularity that has earned them the status of today's best-selling category in fiction. In 1988, Spock's World by Diane Duane became the first Star Trek hardcover bestseller. So yeah, it's a bit of information about this particular story itself and a bit of information about the author. And like I said, I enjoyed reading it. It's a bit of a weird book though. It's a bit of a weird one. At risk of spoilers for anyone who hasn't read this book yet, the book involves Romulans and is centered around ancient Vulcan history, and also has a hostage situation involved on a third alien world. It was a bit of a hard one though. It's like this particular book has two distinctive stories going on, maybe a third, depending on how you go into it. The book starts as a prologue set on ancient Vulcan a few thousand years ago, and sets up the main villain of the story and introduces some interesting history and lore about ancient Vulcan and what was going on in those ancient deserts. I found that rather interesting, to be honest, since we don't know anything, if anything at all, about ancient Vulcan history. So that was a bit of an interesting thing going on, and how it all brings back toward the end of the story. I thought it was an interesting way of going about it. And then that was like the first story, basically, about ancient Vulcan history and the villain coming back and reaching out to the Romulans. Then you've got the main story itself, where Admiral Kirk is caught up in a hostage situation to negotiate a peace deal, if one can be achieved, that is, between two rival factions on a planet under Federation protection. I think is the best way to describe it. Yeah, there's a planet under Federation protection which borders, or is close to the border, to the Romulan Empire. And because of its strategic location, there's always a concern, always a threat of Romulan interference. And that does kind of come into this story a bit. There is definitely a Romulan angle involved. But I think my one criticism of this book, of this story, is that the Romulan angle was underplayed. It had potential to be something more than what we actually saw in the book. I mean, it was good, it was interesting, but they could have made more of it somehow, or connected a couple of dots a lot better than what they ended up actually doing. Hopefully you'll see what I mean yourself if you happen to read this book yourselves, but personally, I always like it when we get a story involving the Romulans, because there's always seemed to be some kind of story involving the Klingons this or the Klingons that. There's a lot of, when it comes to TV shows and films at least, there is a considerable amount of screen time dedicated to the Klingons, which can be good, can be fun and interesting, but sometimes I like to learn more about some of the other powers going on in the Star Trek universe. And the Romulan Star Empire has always been one of my favourite factions in Star Trek. So seeing something to do with them, seeing more appearance of the Romulans is something I'm always going to be keen on getting involved with, either on the TV screen or in the movies, or in this case the books. I always like seeing the Romulans appear. I just think in this book they could have potentially made a bit more of it, or like I said, better connected a couple of dots. But I guess it could have gone either way. If they'd done more Romulans, it could have potentially ruined the story or overshadowed the story they already had going on here. But it's one of them. But despite what I've just said, there is a lot going on in this book. There is a lot going on. Because when we get past the prologue and hit back into, well, the timeline that this story happens, it's the day, the week, the month that the original Enterprise finally gets decommissioned. And the crew are all being reassigned, being debriefed, given leave to adjust to their new situations, being away from the Enterprise. There's a lot of characters, a lot of new characters being introduced, basically. Well, I say new. In the background of the original series of Star Trek, these characters were always there, so in that regard, they're not new, they were always part of the crew, but because you didn't see them, really, on the TV show, you get to, they're new in the sense that this is your first proper introduction to these characters. And there's a lot of introductions, a lot of characters going on, and so a couple of times I caught myself thinking, okay, where's this going? Is this character going to be... are we just seeing this character now, just for the sake of setting up the scene for whatever happens next? Or will this character drop out only to reappear later on in the story? It was a bit of both of that going on, to be honest, yeah. A bit of both of that going on. And as the story progressed, and I got a better grasp and understanding of how the story was unfolding, I wasn't disappointed in how these characters turned out. I was still wondering to what extent this character would do this or that character would do that kind of thing. But even though I liked the way some of this stuff panned out. Now, the main crux of the story is centered on this one planet, which I said was a protectorate of the Federation on Romulan space, on the edge near the border of Romulan space. And a lot of it is about the conflict going on this alien world, and the two factions that are at odds with each other. And Starfleet Command's efforts to get this messy business resolved, especially when hostages are taken. Those hostages being Lieutenant Uhura and Spock's father, Ambassador Sarek. How it handed out, because of the culture and history of this particular people on this planet, was interesting. It never went quite the way I was expecting. Those little subtle twists and little subtle nods, and when I thought things would go one way, it ended up being slightly different, and I was pleasantly surprised by that. It was good. A good way of doing it. Instead of having some club swinging, aggressive, aggressive, hostile alien race coming on, which may or may not be described as a cheap knockoff Klingon thing. No, these new aliens were more measured, more mature in one sense. They weren't idiots at the end of the day, so that was refreshing to go in. And that part of the story was going along with an interesting pace, interesting information, interesting structure. but with only like 23 chapters, 23 chapters or something like that, there came a point when I was wondering, okay, how is this story going to link back to how this story began? Because, like I said, there's definitely two distinct storylines going on in this book. And I was starting to wonder at one point, how on earth were these two stories going to link together for a conclusion to begin with, never mind a satisfying conclusion. And yeah, and then it's hard to explain, but the conclusion worked. Yeah, how the conclusion worked was interesting in its own way. Maybe I need more time to process how things panned out, or maybe I need to read it again. Because sometimes when I get really involved in a book, I tend to read really, really, really quickly, faster than I probably should read. So I need to, in essence, double take the information I've just read. So I need to go back like half a page or a page just to reread what I've just gone through, just to make sure I understand the context of what just happened. But despite that, I did like double check myself, and the way it worked out was actually clever. Well, clever. It was good. How the original start of the book, the prologue, linked into toward the end of the book, was I could see it working. It worked as far as this book was concerned. It worked, and from what little we know about, again, ancient Vulcan history, and especially how Vulcans and the Romulans split apart from each other and went their separate ways, very little is known about that, and some of this tries to fill in the gaps of all that. I suppose, well, the thing is, this is a standalone book at the end of the day, and I imagine if it was to be done again, it might have been better as a part 1 and a part 2, like a 2-part book to expand on certain details, if you will. Or maybe the two stories in this book could have been better off as two separate books. One story here, the other story here. I don't know. But it's one of those things where, yeah, I liked the story, I enjoyed the story, but a couple of points I was thinking, yeah, I got questions, or at the very least, I would like to learn more about this little bit of information I've just read. I don't know, do certain details pop up again in other Star Trek books or somewhere else? If so, how do I find those books? And is it a connection that works? Does it not work? I don't know. But there was a couple of points when I would have liked to have learned more about certain plot points, certain details. So in that regard, it got me thinking, it got me interested. And that's a good thing about a book. If it gets you interested, if it gets you thinking, and in some way it gets you wanting to learn more, then that's a positive end result at the end of the day. Even if it is only a standalone book or a self-contained story, if it's got you wanting more, then that's a sign of a good story, I think. So with that being said, obviously I enjoyed this book. Because I got it from a car boot sale in Wellington a few years ago, I don't know if copies of this book are still in print, or I don't know how you would get your own copy these days. Maybe internet shopping, maybe going into a collector or a specialist book shop, I don't know. there's always the option of internet shopping. Basically, if you can find the correct or the right website that specialises in selling books like this, maybe we can find a copy, I don't know, or finding a specialist bookshop. As I said before in previous videos, some of the best books I've ever picked up and read, similar to this one, have either been a chance encounter at a charity shop, or a random encounter in a second-hand bookshop, or, as in this case, an accidental discovery at a car boot sale. So it's always luck of a draw at the end of the day, but definitely worth the effort. So it's just a matter of becoming a treasure hunter, if you will, seeing if, again, you spot it in a charity shop, car boot sale, second-hand bookshop, or, I don't know, you might get lucky and there might be a website on the internet that can help you get a copy, I don't know. But however your search pans out, if it happens you find a copy like this, by all means, grab it. Personally, I think it's worth the effort picking up a book like this, and regardless on if it's official canon, official history or not, it's still a really good addition to the Star Trek universe, having a book like this to hand. So yeah, definitely worth reading, I'd say. Well, in my opinion anyway. On that note, I'm going to finish this video here. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me talk about this Star Trek novel. I've got a massive pile of other books to start reading, and already I know which Star Trek book to read. Already I know which Star Trek book I want to talk about and read next, but that's for another video. In the meantime, like I say, thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I hope you're all having a good day. Have a good weekend, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you all soon in the next video. Take care and goodbye.